Thank you for coming to this talk about making open source and businesses successful together. My name's Liz. I work at Isovalent, which is the company that originally created the Cilium project, and we built a business around that. And then about 18 months ago, we were acquired by Cisco. I'm an engineer by background, and I've written some books. This talk is not really about the books, but I will mention that not only do we have them available to download from the Isovalent site, but we just found 2 more boxes of the container security book, so I will be signing some more around 4:15 this afternoon. So yeah, there are a few more copies of that available. I have been involved in the CNCF for quite a long time in various roles, like being on the governing board. I chaired the TOC for a few years. And so I guess I've had the perspective of seeing businesses from the point of view of being a vendor, from being a maintainer, from the perspective of the TOC and the foundation. And I cannot promise a magic recipe to make businesses successful, but I think I did learn a few things along the way that I want to try and share. So there was a report last year from Harvard Business School that estimated the value of open source software. And if you take the most commonly used pieces of open source code, it would cost over $4 billion to recreate them. But the value they're providing is massively bigger, nearly $9 trillion, because it's being used and reused by so many different companies. So that means there is a vast amount of value being created in open source software, and it makes sense to me that we can capture some of that in businesses that will ultimately mean we can get paid. Because I've only got like 30 minutes, so I can't dismantle capitalism, but so we'll just assume we all need to be paid. The same report found that the vast majority of that value is being created by just 5% of open source developers, because just because you write some code doesn't necessarily inherently mean it's valuable. But I think there is a good chance that the people who are attending this conference who are building software are creating value because they're building cloud native infrastructure that's valuable for businesses who are running their software on this new standard platform. Kubernetes has pretty much become the standard for running software, the same way that we have standards for electricity. You can plug your equipment into a socket and get pretty much the same frequency and voltage regardless of the socket. And the same is true for running your software on Kubernetes. It's a standard. So if we're creating this vast amount of value, why on earth do we give it away for free? One of the reasons we give away software in open source is because it drives adoption, and particularly in software, adoption helps to set those standards. Kubernetes has become the standard it is because lots of people used it, and it's very much, does anybody remember the kind of Betamax versus VHS wars? Yeah, so there are people who will tell you that Betamax was higher quality, but I think VHS machines were cheaper, so they were easier to adopt, and they just basically made Betamax obsolete. People were voting with their wallets. And for something to become widely adopted, maybe being cheaper is better, and the extreme of being cheap is free. Open source software being free, that removes a lot of the friction to adoption. It's not just about price, it's also about licensing. The fact that in the foundation we're using typically Apache 2, very permissive licenses, makes it easy for businesses to adopt that software because it comes with no obligations on them, no conditions. But just because something is free, well, open source software can be free, like a puppy can be free. I can give you a puppy, but you are then going to be on the hook for walking it and feeding it. You're going to have to buy that food. You're going to have to pick up after that puppy. And the same is true for software. You can't necessarily just run it in production with no effort. So as an enterprise, you might choose to invest in people and time and effort to look after the puppy, or you might pay somebody to do the puppy care for you. And hence we have lots of commercial distributions of cloud native projects. For example, Kubernetes, there are dozens of distributions, almost all of which are some way paid for by the consumer of those distributions. So an open source project is part of an ecosystem that links developers and projects and the users of that project. And we get this lovely virtuous cycle of innovation where the developers are creating something, users are trying it out, they're giving feedback, they're raising issues, communities get built around the project, and everything moves forward. This is one of the beautiful things about open source. But developers' time is valuable, and again, because capitalism, they need to be paid, and funding has to come from somewhere. There are models, there are different ways of getting money into the hands of developers, but particularly in this ecosystem, the majority of developers are being paid by a company. That company could be an end user, but a lot of them, it's vendors, and that's okay. How many of you have been in the sponsor showcase so far in the show? Put your hand up. Keep your hand up if you've taken like a piece of swag or you've had like a free coffee or whatever, okay. Now I want you to keep your hand up if you offered to pay for that free thing. Okay, nobody does that, right? You're giving away open source software. You cannot then expect people to pay you for it. It's free. You made it zero value, essentially. It's not really zero value, but you can't charge money for it. So you're going to have to find some way of adding value. Oh, I meant to mention the trust thing. So trust is inherently important to open source projects, and we can kind of capture trust in a contract or in a purchase agreement. I think as an engineer, I started off feeling a bit like uncomfortable with the idea of charging people money for, you know, it's like, is this some kind of exploitation? I don't really want to talk about money. But when you think about it, you can be a happy customer. You know, if I buy myself a new bike, I'm probably extremely happy with the bike that I bought, even though it cost me money. And the person who the bike shop is also happy, and we are aligned. Our interests are aligned if I bought a bike that I enjoy. And the same thing can be true for our software. Selling a software project as a vendor, or selling a product as a vendor is not an inherently bad thing. It can be actively good if the customers are happy customers and our interests are aligned. But we established you can't just give away the free or you can't sell the free thing. You have to add some additional value. So if you're a vendor building a business around an open source project, there are lots of different options for adding value, but there has to be something, whether it's support or builds or training or additional features, some way of adding extra value. We can think about open source a bit like a campfire. So let's say we collect some firewood, we find an open piece of ground, we build a fire, somebody has a box of matches, we can light that fire. And we can say that's a community fire. Anybody is welcome to come and warm themselves at the fire. Maybe we even put some effort into inviting people to come and join us around the fire, and we build this community. And some of those community members might start saying, hey, can I help out with the firewood collecting? They start contributing to that common good, the fire. And then maybe some people start going, oh, you know, we could toast some marshmallows. That would be really nice. I've got some marshmallows. I've added some value over the top of the fire. Maybe somebody starts doing a marshmallow delivery service to people who aren't even at the campfire. There are ways of building value on top of that campfire. But it is very important that if you're going to start a toasted marshmallow delivery business around the campfire, you kind of need to know that the fire, you're going to always be allowed to use the heat from that fire for your toasting. You don't want the people who created that fire to turn around and go, yeah, toasting, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And that's one of the reasons why we want guarantees around licensing. This is where foundations can be really important. Foundations like the CNCF can offer services to projects, and we'll kind of come back to that in a moment. But the most important thing that foundations are doing is guaranteeing that the licensing doesn't change. And so that creates an opportunity for not just the original creators of the project, but for other people to be able to use that intellectual property. If you create a project, if you are the people who built that campfire, you only have one opportunity to put, well, once you are accepted into the foundation, you can only do that once. You can't take it back again. It is a one-way operation. And one sort of caution that I would have for people who are building a project and thinking about putting it in a foundation is to be very conscious and aware of what you're doing. You know, you are putting that IP in the hands of the community, and it is no longer yours to control. You can still massively influence it because you're the experts who created that project, but it is no longer yours. And I think the timing around this can be very important. If you want to build a business, but you put the project into the foundation, it is very clear that anybody else could also start toasting marshmallows around your campfire. And that's okay. You just have to be conscious of it, and you have to have figured out, well, what the VCs would call defensive moat? You know, what's my advantage? For Isovalent, it was expertise. We're working on a very complex project, and it's really hard for people to compete with the level of expertise that we have. The other thing that people do when they put projects into a foundation is they can have unrealistic expectations of the benefits. And in particular, the foundation can assist and amplify the work that you do, particularly on like popularizing your project. But they don't just do the work for you, and there's no magic wand, and you still have to invest in building the community. You still have to put effort into inviting people to that campfire. It won't happen just magically. The maintainers of a project and the contributors of a project are doing that voluntarily. There's no contractual obligation for anybody to do any work on an open source project. Now, of course, they might also be employees of a company, either an end user company or a vendor. And if they are, then the employer can influence what they work on, and they can kind of obligate them to work on certain features or to do certain work on a project. But I think it's really important that we bear in mind there is no contractual obligation for anybody to put a single moment's work into any open source project. Their only obligation is going to be contractually to their employer. And the vendors are also not obliged to do any work. It might well be in their interest, but they don't have to. As a maintainer, as somebody who's invested time and energy and effort into a project, that earns the right to continue to set the direction of the project. This is one of the reasons why I think it's very important that projects continue to be allowed their own governance. The governance cannot be like one size fits all. And maintainers who've done all that work over months or probably years want to see that project be successful. a vendor who builds a product around a project and who employs maintainers and contributors probably also has interests aligned with the success of that project. And one of the things that I think we can lose sight of in the foundation is that being vendor neutral doesn't have to mean there must be multiple vendors selling competitive products around a project. If you have a project with 0 vendors who actually existentially depend on that project, they might be contributing to it. They might have sort of a passing interest in it. But if it isn't actually fundamentally what they are basing their business on, then they may just walk away from it. If they're a vendor whose business depends on the project, that's probably the best way to see sustained investment in that project. Ideally, it's more than one, but one vendor is probably better for the sustainability of a project than any number who actually don't have a real dependency on that project. And I think it's also worth bearing in mind that when we think about the sustainability of a project, it's the maintainers who are most emotionally invested. They've done all that work, and they may be more interested in staying with the project than they are in staying with a particular employer. So I think that's another thing to bear in mind when we talk about the long-term sustainability of a project. Oh, hit the wrong button. Nobody is obliged to, I said maintainers are volunteers and they're not obliged to do any work. And in particular, they are not obliged to do work for other people. You don't have to spend time accepting other people's work if it isn't aligned with the direction of the project that you've set, that you believe in. And Solomon Hykes, who was the founder of Docker, put it very well when he said, no is temporary, yes is forever. So if somebody wants to make a change in a project, first of all, you don't have to accept it unless you really think it is the right thing for your project. And secondly, if it's a big change, you don't have to take on the burden of maintaining that into the future. You may well want to you might want the contributor to have built up trust with you before you accept it, so that you have faith that they will continue to work on it. You want to know that their interests are aligned with your project as well. And I think it's a very difficult balancing act between doing the work that will encourage adoption of your project and maybe subsequently lead to more enterprise users of your project versus giving away value. As an example, builds. So this can be quite controversial, right? Open source, the clue is in the word source. The thing that you're creating is the source code. You're not obliged as an open source project to create builds. Now, a lot of the time we do because it makes it a lot easier for people to adopt the project. But I think this is another example where expectations may be set and people need to be very careful about how they express what they're prepared to do. But if you're the consumer, particularly if you're an enterprise consuming an open source project for free, it's not really fair to assume that somebody else is going to put the work in to carry on doing things like creating builds. As a maintainer, it can be hard to kind of keep track of the fact that, yeah, you are not obligated to do this work. And I think it's really important that people do that and they recognize where they are adding value and make a conscious choice about when to give that value away and when to charge money for it. Another time where I've seen people really giving value away is where they're super excited because this Fortune 500 company is using their project and fantastic, that's great. And that's a real sign, it's an endorsement of the work that they've done. But when it gets to the point where a bank is messaging a maintainer demanding like urgent assistance because their open source project is a dependency for them in production, I'm like, whoa, there are some big signals here. Like, this is a customer, well, a user with money who is dependent on your code. Don't give it away for free. You know, get paid for that, whether it's through a business or directly, whatever it is. If people are signaling that they need your help and they value it, there is a monetary value for it, please think about charging money for that work. I think another mistake that people can fall into is thinking that a project has to be a democracy. A healthy, long life, sustainable, successful project is about consensus around the direction of that project. And you don't necessarily build consensus by having votes. If you think about it, democracies often turn into two parties with very different views fighting. And I don't think that's a very successful model for a healthy open source project. So this is another kind of, I guess, soapbox thing for me. Open source has to be about consensus. And if we get to the point where people are kind of talking about voting, then that's not a great, you know, you need votes to make sure that, you know, people are comfortable with, let's say, bringing a new maintainer on board. There are circumstances where a vote makes sense. But ideally, there is consensus so that the outcome of the vote is already kind of a given, you know, because the community of maintainers is aligned and has a consensus view. So projects need sustained investment. They need resources. They need expert maintainers who know that project to keep that project going. And one of the best ways for a project to get that sustained investment is because there's a vendor interested in that project, who's aligned with that project, whose very existence depends on that project. And end users also may very well want to pay a vendor. And this is the ideal situation we want to be in this ecosystem. If you're an end user, maybe think about whether there are ways you could encourage and make these projects more sustainable by investing resources or paying a vendor. That might be the easier way to do it. I'm not saying don't use open source projects, but I am saying funding has to come from somewhere, and it is okay to be a vendor and align your interests with your end users through a commercial agreement. Because fundamentally, the success of this ecosystem all depends on aligned interests. We come back to that original model where trust is central. Trust can be formalized through agreements and happy customer-vendor relationship. I am a big believer in open source. I think open source is an incredible way to drive innovation, and there are some projects where it's never going to make sense to build a commercial product around it. But where there is, if you can really add value, then don't feel bad about that. Take advantage of it. Don't let yourself be taken advantage of by doing work for free that is really adding value to somebody who is being paid a lot of money to use your software. It's all about alignment. I hope that maybe one or two things there sort of struck a chord. I just hope. And yeah, if you have any questions, I think we've got 2 or 3 minutes left, maybe? Yeah. Great, I see a question.
How would you think about measuring consensus? Or is that something that you just know when you have consensus?
Okay, yeah, so the question is how do you go about measuring consensus, or is it something that you kind of know when you have, like pornography, you know when you see it, right? Yeah, I mean, I think for the maintainers of a project to really sort of be successful and healthy, they kind of have to have communication, you know, that we're obviously, we're all using GitHub, we're communicating through GitHub, but maybe we're also using Slack and we are exchanging ideas, maybe we're doing things through design documents or whatever it is. Communication is key. So, for example, in Cilium, I can't really think of a time where we've actually had a vote on anything other than contributing Cilium to the CNCF and bringing new maintainers on board. And, I don't remember a time when, I think maybe once or twice people have gone, oh, I just want to check that. But, and I think that all comes from having, and we do have, maintainers from different organizations, from different companies. Don't get me wrong there. But because they've worked on the project for so long, and we do have a very high bar for bringing people into being a maintainer, at that point, there's usually a pretty strong relationship and good communication. Any other questions? I see one there, yeah.
What are your opinions about some open source projects? They get big and then they close source some features, especially happens with unpack. In a lot of projects, they'll implement unpack, but that would be closed source.
Okay, yeah. So the question is, what's my thoughts on open source projects that subsequently make some features closed source, and in particular things like RBAC or I think things like single sign-on are a really good example. But I actually think that's okay, right? I wouldn't encourage stripping a feature away, like withdrawing a feature. But I think it's completely fine to say, here is a project, it works. I mean, this is pretty much a philosophy that we have in Cilium, where you can take Cilium, you can operate it in production, and, a lot of people do, and they're using the open source solution. But there are a few features that we have that are enterprise only. And either you can kind of build them yourself or work around them, or you can come and, it might be more cost effective to pay for it. Single sign-on is a really good example. There's actually a site, it's supposed to be like a kind of naming and shaming of companies who charge extra for single sign-on. I'm like,
SSO.tax.
That's the one, SSO.tax. But I'm like, why is that not reasonable? Those vendors, because capitalism, have to make some money, and they're charging it to, like, single sign-on almost by definition means you've got more than one user, right? It's a company. And often it's because they've got thousands and they're a giant enterprise. I am very, I'm involved in security. I very much believe in security, but single sign-on is not, it's a feature to make it easier for large enterprises who have deep pockets to make that security easier. I don't see why a vendor shouldn't be allowed to charge for that feature, because it's not something that if you're doing a home lab, you don't need it. That's my opinion. It's just my personal opinion. Gentleman at the mic.
Please follow. Sorry, otherwise we'll just So, but I don't know if this happens, but what if someone else other than the vendor, there are like a bunch of enterprises who are all using that feature and would love to have an open source SSO, for example, SSO feature.
Yeah.
So won't allow that to come in there at that point.
Yeah, this is the question of what if somebody wants to contribute that feature and do the work. And yes, we've absolutely seen that scenario, and my attitude is fine. If they want to contribute that feature and they can do it to the quality standards required, then great. As sort of a corollary to that, just because the vendor has a commercial solution, so they know how it's done, they are not obliged to share that with the people who are now trying to solve it open source. They shouldn't block it just because, we've got that as an enterprise feature and therefore we're not going to accept your contribution. That is not acceptable. But they don't have to do the work. They can go, yeah, fine, do a design. We'll critique the design. You're going to have to do it. You're going to have to maintain it. You're going to have to convince us that you're aligned, and then great. And we have seen that happen in Cilium, where sometimes people have been able to implement features that we've previously had closed source. It's fine. Yeah. Sorry, you go ahead.
Thank you, Liz. A very interesting talk you had there. I'm part of a new project from the Linux Foundation called the Media Exchange Layer. Not to get into the details, but essentially the media companies have agreed in order to share memory in containerized environments, there need to be a common standard. And it's at the core, it's working very well. However, when it comes to businesses trying to make money out of the project, how can we encourage them that contributing to open source would result in financial gain for them?
I think it comes down to what can they... So is this vendors making those contributions that you're talking about?
It's an open source. There's a list of vendors who are participating in the base layer.
Right.
But then there's a lot of questions. I really like your slide where you said different ways to add value to an open source project.
And I wouldn't say that's an exhaustive list. I think it's just a set of ideas. It's really just acknowledging that if the software, if the source code is free, something else has to be additional value. You've got to save somebody some effort somewhere else to make it worthwhile them paying for it. And that could be support, as simple as.
Thank you.
Hi, Liz. How do you balance security in with open source? And do you start paying at a certain point for some security features or functionality?
So I think it is okay to let's flip that on its head. Mm-hmm. And we've seen this right now with the FFmpeg situation. Why should someone do any work, security or otherwise, for free? Now, they might be motivated to do work for free because ultimately they're interested in the long-term future of their project. But I would always turn the question around of why should someone have expectations that it's given away for free? For a piece of software to be successful, somebody is going to have to address security issues. If we're talking about updating dependencies and fixing vulnerabilities, somebody's going to have to do that. And a lot of the time that's done by a security team who are essentially volunteers, arguably being paid to do that voluntary work, but it's not there is no contractual requirement for them to do it. It's just in everybody's interest to keep that project secure. So it's a kind of fine balancing act around, and this is again where if there's a vendor who is existentially bound to the success of that project, they are highly motivated to keep the security of that project going. But if nobody is kind of invested, why should people do the work? And there's a balancing act. Does that answer? Yeah.
Thank you very much for the great talk. Do you see any reason for businesses to open source their projects but acquire external developers?
Do you mean as a contractor or as...
No, I mean to make some projects open source, like Cloudflare. They open source a bunch of them, but they said, hey, we're not interested in contribution. So I'm wondering why you...
Yeah, I think that's completely within their rights to do that. I mean, not as a foundation project, but as an open source project. And there are reasons to do that, right? If you... again, a sort of balancing act between if you bring in an external contribution, you're going to have to maintain that. And maybe there are project standards or whatever that you want people to adhere to. It might be as simple as having some kind of CLA or DCO, but you on steroids, you just want more knowledge about who is contributing to your code. You're creating a project. It's entirely your prerogative to run the project that way. Now, you've got to balance that against, are you upsetting those contributors by not accepting their fixes? Is that bad for your long-term project? But I don't think it's like an obligation. It's, it also, you know, calls into a question like, how are you going to keep that project going? Maybe you're going to keep that project going simply by always hiring new people to work on that project. It does mean that project is bound to the success of that company.
Okay, thank you.
Several companies have in the past few years changed their open source licenses to things like the SSPL or the BSL, but I've noticed a couple of companies have now either changed those licenses to like the AGPL, or they've added the AGPL as a license available, which, you know, kind of has the same goal of everybody talks about keeping hyperscalers from, you know, out competing you, and that's kind of what the AGPL is all about. Do you think that is something that actually is going to represent a long-term turn away from those, you know, source available licenses to the AGPL exists, let's just go ahead and use it? Or is that just kind of on a case-by-case thing, and like Redis and Elastic just happen to be good cases for that kind of a license change?
Yeah, I do think it's a case-by-case thing. And I guess a couple of things that I think about personally around that. So first is, I don't particularly subscribe to the kind of religion around exactly what qualifies as an open source license or not. I'm, you know, that kind of, it's like a dancing on the head of a pin argument. I'm just not interested. I'm more interested in, okay, what can people do with whatever the license is? What are they allowed to do? What are they obliged to do? It's more interesting. I think in many of these license change cases, you know, they've had the right to do what they've done. Sometimes they've messaged it incredibly badly. I think sometimes they've, you know, kind of acted in a short-term way that maybe or may or may not prove to be good for their businesses. I think that, you know, they're in the right, they have the right to do that, you know, in the same way that you have the right to do a really bad strategic move. It's, you know, as a business, you might make mistakes. I think a lot of it has been about the expectations that have been set over the long term, maybe not formally, and then people being really bad at communicating a change in those expectations.